I had just finished fixing her engine when my daughter tugged at my sleeve, eyes wide like she'd solved a mystery. She pointed at the woman standing in front of me and whispered, "Daddy, she's my mom. Please marry her." I laughed at first, until another little voice echoed the same words from the back seat. The sun sagged toward the edge of the dusty town, turning the garage windows the color of old copper as Daniel worked the last smear of grease from his palms with a rag that had seen better days. The building ticked and cooled around him, metal settling, tools quieting, while the scent of oil and hot rubber hung in the air like a tired promise. He felt that familiar ache in his shoulders from a day spent under hoods and on creepers, the kind of ache that reminded him he could still keep a roof over their heads. Being a single dad wasn't a slogan to him. It was the rhythm of mornings packed with lunchboxes, afternoons timed around school pickup, nights calibrated to the soft timbre of his daughter's laugh. Money ran thin more often than he liked, but when Emma laughed, really laughed, he could breathe again. He flipped the sign to closed and reached for the light switch when headlights washed over the bay door. A sleek black SUV coasted in, limping the last few feet, hood feathering steam. The engine coughed, shuddered, and surrendered. Daniel paused, then let the switch go. "All right," he muttered to himself, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "One more won't break the night." The driver's door opened, and a woman in a tailored blazer stepped out, heels clicking on the concrete like a metronome racing ahead of the beat. She looked like she belonged in a glass tower, not under the low eaves of his shop, but her eyes, ringed with the soft bruise of a long day, told him everything. She approached with careful politeness, as if not to jostle whatever strength she had left. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late," she said, voice low, controlled. "My engine just died. I didn't know where else to go." Daniel took in the steam, the faint sweet smell of coolant, the way the idol had trembled before the stall. He nodded toward the bay. "You're in luck, ma'am. I never leave a stranded car, or driver, unfixed." The line came easy. It was true enough to sound like kindness and habit at the same time. He lifted the bay door again, and the evening air unfurled, warmer than it should have been, carrying a thin hush of crickets from the lot. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed to life. The woman, Claire, he'd learn in a moment, stood a pace back, hands tucked together as if she needed them to be still. Daniel popped the hood and braced it with the rod, a ribbon of steam licking his forearm before it vanished. "I'm Daniel," he offered, leaning in to trace the coolant hose with two knuckles, then the serpentine belt, listening for what a machine won't confess unless you quiet down and let it talk. "Claire," she said, almost on a breath, "I'm just coming from work." Her gaze flicked to the SUV, then to the open bay as if willing both to behave. He could have started with a number. He could have listed parts and labor and after-hours rates, put a price on her problem, and stepped back. Instead, he reached for a light and angled it across the engine, letting the facts show themselves. "Let's see what you've got," he said, softer than before. Up close, he noticed the tremor in her exhale at the word God, the kind of tremor that comes when your day has taken one turn too many. People slid their stories across his counter all the time without meaning to. He learned not to pry and not to bill for what he didn't have to. From the office doorway, a small sneaker scuffed the threshold. "We're still open?" Emma asked, a whisper made of curiosity and bedtime slipping later than planned. "Just for a minute," Daniel said without looking away from the engine, his tone equal parts apology and promise. He tightened a clamp, checked the reservoir, and followed the line of failure backward, piecing together the stall like a riddle with greasy clues. "Do you do this a lot?" Claire asked, half a question, half a way to keep from thinking about the dark settling outside. "Fix cars." Daniel's mouth quirked. "Most days, yes." He glanced over, caught by the steadiness in her expression, a steadiness that looked like it had been purchased by too many long nights. "I mean after closing." He shrugged. Engines don't check their watches. He worked, and the shop filled with the quiet company of competent hands doing what they were made to do. Claire watched the way he moved. No fuss, no theatrics. Just a man listening to a stubborn engine and answering with patience. When he fetched a wrench, he set the old one down where it belonged. When he leaned in, it was with the attention people reserve for complicated things they want to keep running. She folded her arms, then unfolded them, as if even her posture had been taught to negotiate. Emma drifted closer, magnets in her pockets for any mystery. She looked from her dad to the SUV and back again, reading the room the way kids do, as temperature, not as language. Daniel felt her presence like a hand at his back. He tightened the last clamp, topped the coolant, checked for leaks, and thumbed the starter with a mechanic's prayer that sounded exactly like confidence. The engine caught, hesitated, then settled into a contrite hum. "There we go," he said, closing the hood with a careful press so the latch wouldn't slam. He wiped his hands, then wiped them again, a habit he couldn't shake. Claire released a breath he hadn't noticed she'd been holding. Relief softened her face, rounding the edges of what the day had carved into it. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than their syllables. Her hand went to her bag by reflex, professional muscle memory, reaching for a transaction that would square things between them. Daniel shook his head almost before she found the zipper. "Just get home safe," he said. "That's enough." Surprise flickered through her features, quick as a spark. People in her world rarely met kindness without a ledger. She studied him, perhaps trying to locate the angle and finding none. He rolled his shoulders, suddenly embarrassed by how much the moment felt like something larger than a fixed hose and a quiet favor. Behind the smoked rear glass of the SUV, a movement brushed the corner of Emma's eye. She turned toward it, curious as the evening held its breath. The garage lights hummed. Outside, the crickets tuned up. Daniel reached for the base switch, meaning to send them all back into the night with a reliable engine. And then Emma took one small step toward the rear door, as if the mystery on the other side of the glass had called her by name. Emma's sneakers squeaked softly against the concrete as she leaned closer to the tinted glass of the SUV's backseat window. Her small palms pressed flat, leaving faint smudges as her breath fogged a circle she could peer through. She cupped her hands around her face, narrowing her view as though she were peeking into a treasure chest. On the other side of the glass sat a girl about her age, 6 or maybe 7, with hair that fell in loose strands across her cheeks. She clutched a teddy bear, so worn it looked like it had lived 100 adventures already. The bear's fur was patchy, its button eye slightly loose, but the way the girl held it, tight, protective, said it was still the most important thing in the world. For a heartbeat, the two children just stared at each other. Emma's eyes widened, and then the shyest of smiles crept across the stranger's face. It wasn't bold or practiced. It was tentative, like sunlight through a crack in storm clouds. Emma gasped, her whole body rising onto tiptoe. Something clicked inside her with the certainty only children possess, a kind of instinct adults tend to bury under logic and hesitation. She tugged sharply at her father's sleeve, pulling him down so her whisper wouldn't carry to Claire. "Daddy," she breathed. "Eyes still locked on the girl in the SUV. She's my mom. Please marry her." Daniel nearly dropped the rag in his hand. He turned his head, blinking at Emma as though she had just spoken in another language. "Emma," he hissed softly, half a chuckle caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" Her little brow furrowed in frustration, lips pressing together in that stubborn way he knew all too well. "I just know," she whispered urgently, not daring to look away from the girl inside the car. "She's the one. Don't you see?" Daniel let out a breath, shaking his head, both amused and unsettled. Childhood imagination, he told himself. Emma had been a dreamer since she could talk, always weaving stories from shadows and strangers. Still, the conviction in her voice, clear, steady, certain, lodged somewhere deep inside him. He bent lower, whispering back, "Hush, detective. Don't say things like that." But Emma's eyes didn't waver. They were fixed on Claire now, bright with the sort of hope that adults often guard against. Daniel followed her gaze for just a moment. Claire stood with her arms folded lightly, watching him work, shoulders still tense from the day, but softened by something he couldn't quite name. She didn't look like anyone's fantasy. She looked real, weary but composed, the kind of strong that comes from carrying too much without complaint. Emma tugged again. "Daddy," she repeated, quieter now, almost reverent. "I'm telling the truth." Daniel pressed the rag to his hands, as if grease could distract him from the strange weight of her words. "Emma," he said finally, his voice low and gentle. "Sometimes your imagination runs faster than the rest of us can keep up. Let's not get carried away." But even as he said it, he saw the way Emma's face stayed alight, a glow of certainty that refused to dim. Children didn't reason, they believed. And in that belief, for a flickering moment, Daniel felt the strange, unsteady pull of something larger than himself, like the turning of a key in a lock he hadn't touched in years. The engine in the SUV gave a settling click as the coolant cooled. Claire shifted her stance, oblivious to the whispered exchange, and Daniel cleared his throat, straightening up as though nothing had been said. But Emma lingered by the window, her reflection mingling with the other girls in the glass, two faces lined up by fate, as if they had always been meant to find one another in the middle of a small-town garage at sunset. Daniel slid the wrench back into place with a practiced motion, the kind of motion his hands could manage even when his mind was chasing his daughter's odd whisper. He told himself to focus on the work. The car was speaking in its own language of leaks and rattles, and he knew how to listen. A loosened clamp, a tired belt, coolant run thin. Nothing he hadn't seen 100 times before. Claire stood a few feet away, arms folded but not defensive, more like she was holding herself together after a day that had already asked too much. She shifted her weight from one heel to the other, eyes flicking between Daniel's steady hands and the shadowed street outside. In her world, everything had a price tag, billable hours, contracts, even small kindnesses. Watching a man work without once mentioning cost unsettled her in ways she didn't have words for. Daniel tightened the last bolt, tested the line, and let the engine turn over. It roared once, coughed like a smoker, then steadied into a healthier rhythm. He gave a satisfied nod, the sound of a machine returning to order as comforting to him as any lullaby. "She's good to go," he said, closing the hood with a gentle click. Claire exhaled, her shoulders lowering as if the tension had been holding her taller than she really felt. She reached quickly for her purse, fingers brushing the zipper with the reflex of someone who had never walked away from help unpaid. "What do I owe you?" she asked, already pulling her wallet free. Daniel shook his head before the bills even surfaced. "Nothing," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who meant it. "Just get home safe. That's enough." Claire froze, her hand hovering in midair, the wallet heavy in her palm. She blinked once, twice, as if he'd spoken an unfamiliar language. "You're not serious," she whispered, the words fragile in the air. He wiped his hands again on the rag, almost sheepish under her gaze. "I've been where you are," he admitted, glancing at the ground for a moment before looking back up. "Some nights I didn't know if I'd make it home. Someone helped me once. I guess I'm just paying it forward." The truth in his voice caught her off guard. In courtrooms, people lied for money, twisted facts into weapons. Out here, in the scent of oil and metal, she found herself believing him instantly. His kindness didn't carry strings, didn't come wrapped in fine print. Her lips parted, then closed again, her throat tightening against words she hadn't planned to speak. For a heartbeat, the garage wasn't just a place of engines and tools. It was a space where something else was being repaired, something she had thought too dented to mend. Daniel gave a half-smile, embarrassed by her silence. "It's really fine," he said, tucking the rag into his back pocket. "Safe road, that's payment enough." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them carried the hum of the engine and the faint rasp of crickets outside. Claire's eyes softened, the practiced steel of her courtroom stare slipping away. She saw not just a mechanic, but a man who worked because he believed in keeping things running. Cars, nights, maybe even people. And for the first time that long day, Claire felt something ease inside her, something lighter than exhaustion or duty. It was the shock of simple kindness, the kind that asked for nothing but lingered anyway. For a brief moment the garage felt calm, like everything had found its proper order again. The SUV, purring with relief, Daniel setting his tools aside, Claire still clutching her wallet but no longer certain she should use it. Then, with the soft hum of an electric motor, the back window of the SUV rolled down. A small face appeared, leaning forward as far as the seat belt would allow. The girl inside, Claire's daughter, looked at her mother first, then at Daniel, then at Emma. Her teddy bear was pressed against her chest, as though she needed courage borrowed from its threadbare body. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but it was clear enough to cut through the quiet air of the garage. "Mommy," she said, eyes wide with a strange certainty, "he's the one. Please marry him." The sentence dropped into the space like a pebble into a still pond, ripples spreading instantly, silently, impossible to stop. Daniel blinked, caught utterly off guard. His rag slipped from his hand, landing on the floor without either adult noticing. For a second, he thought he had misheard, but the girl's eyes stayed locked on him, earnest, pleading in a way that no child rehearses. Claire's face flushed hot, the practiced composure of a lawyer cracking into surprise. A nervous laugh escaped her lips, brittle and awkward. "Kids say the strangest things, don't they?" she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as if that small act could cover her unease. But before Daniel could nod politely and let the moment pass, Emma stepped closer to him, chin raised in defiance of adult disbelief. She nodded vigorously, her ponytail bouncing with the force of her conviction. "No, Daddy," she insisted, her small voice filled with that stubborn fire he knew too well. "She's telling the truth. You fix cars, but maybe you're supposed to fix hearts, too." The words struck harder than Daniel expected. He opened his mouth to hush her, to remind her not to speak out of turn, but the look in Emma's eyes, bright, certain, unwavering, stopped him. It was the same look he had seen when she solved puzzles long before he thought she could, when she noticed what others missed. She wasn't being fanciful. She was declaring something she believed down to her bones. Claire's throat tightened. She blinked hard, fighting the sting of tears. Since her divorce, she had carried her struggles in silence. Long hours in court, sleepless nights juggling deadlines and bedtime stories, the constant ache of being strong for a little girl who needed her. She had never told anyone how heavy it was. And now, here was her daughter, breaking open the silence with one sentence that exposed everything. Her longing, her loneliness, her hope. Daniel shifted uneasily, unsure what to do with the storm of feeling crashing against him. He wasn't used to being anyone's answer, let alone a stranger's. But in the eyes of two children, his daughter and Claire's, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only belief. The air grew very still, so still that even the crickets outside seemed to pause. Daniel swallowed. His voice caught somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh. He had no words that fit. And maybe, he thought as he glanced at Claire, words weren't the point right now. The children had already spoken the truth in a way only children could. Claire cleared her throat, her laugh fading into silence. She looked at Daniel, then at her daughter, then at Emma, her defenses falling piece by piece. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a lawyer or a divorcee or a woman measured by billable hours. She felt like a mother standing in front of something she had thought she might never find again, a chance, fragile but real. Claire stood in the cooling silence of the garage, her daughter's words still trembling in the air between them. Daniel bent to pick up the rag he had dropped, grateful for the excuse to look away, to buy himself a second to breathe. Emma, however, stayed planted at his side, eyes shining with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. Children had a way of dragging truths into the open without apology. Claire pressed her lips together, the faintest smile tugging at the corner despite her embarrassment. She had laughed off her daughter's whisper, but her chest still ached with the weight of it. This was no ordinary evening, and she knew it. She took a slow breath, then lifted her chin, decision hardening behind her tired eyes. "At least let me buy you and your daughter dinner," she said softly. Her voice held no room for argument. It wasn't a bribe, it was an offering. "I can't drive away tonight, and just pretend this was only about a car." Daniel hesitated, caught between the instinct to refuse and the tug of Emma's hopeful gaze. He saw the way Claire stood, shoulders square but trembling underneath, as though strength had become her default, even when she longed for ease. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally gave a small nod. "All right," he said, "but nothing fancy. We're talking burgers and fries, not five-star." Relief flickered across Claire's face, small but genuine. "Burgers and fries it is," she agreed. The diner down the street welcomed them with the golden glow of neon and the smell of coffee that had probably been brewing since morning. Vinyl booths creaked as they slid in, Daniel and Emma on one side, Claire and her daughter on the other. For a long moment, it felt strange, like sitting across from a reflection of themselves, two fractured families trying to figure out if they still fit anywhere. Menus went mostly unread. The girls were already giggling, crayons scattered across paper placemats, trading colors as if they had known each other for years instead of minutes. Emma drew a stick figure with wild hair fixing a car. Claire's daughter added a heart over it and pointed shyly at Daniel. He felt his ears warm, pretending not to notice. Claire leaned back slightly, studying the scene with quiet astonishment. She doesn't open up like this often, she admitted, her voice low, almost confessional. Since the divorce, she's been cautious. Careful, like she's waiting for people to leave. Daniel's eyes softened as he glanced at Emma, laughing freely with her new friend. I know the feeling, he said. His words were simple, but beneath them ran the current of long nights where he'd tucked his daughter in and wondered how he'd get through the next day. Food arrived, plates clattering with burgers dripping juice, fries steaming in the center. The girls dug in, ketchup smudging their fingers, laughter spilling over every bite. Claire and Daniel ate slower, the silence between them surprisingly comfortable. Claire sipped from her glass of water, then set it down, fingers brushing condensation across the table. I'm used to people doing things for me with an angle, she admitted quietly. In my world, kindness always comes with a bill. But you didn't ask for anything. Daniel shrugged, chewing on a fry, uncomfortable with praise but unwilling to dismiss it. Sometimes helping is just helping, he said. Doesn't need to be more than that. For the first time that day, Claire laughed, not the brittle laugh she had used to cover her daughter's words, but a soft, genuine sound that surprised even her. It wasn't the laugh of a lawyer or a woman carrying too much. It was just her. Daniel heard it and realized he liked the sound more than he expected. By the time the plates were cleared and the crayons had dulled to stubs, the four of them had settled into something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Daniel found himself wondering, as he helped Emma into her jacket, how a chance breakdown on a tired evening could unfold into this. Laughter, warmth, and the fragile beginning of something new. Claire, watching him out of the corner of her eye as she held her daughter's hand, wondered the same thing. She hadn't been looking for connection. Yet here it was, served alongside fries in a diner booth, as undeniable as the whispered prayers of two children who already seemed to know the ending before the adults dared to believe it. What began as a single dinner turned into a rhythm that wove itself quietly into their lives. Claire found reasons to stop by the garage, sometimes with a coffee in hand, sometimes with the excuse of a rattle in the engine that Daniel knew full well had been fixed the week before. She never said it outright, but he could see it in her eyes. It wasn't the car that kept bringing her back. Emma and Claire's daughter, Lily, he learned on the second visit, became inseparable almost immediately. Whenever Claire pulled into the lot, Emma would race out from the small office, ponytail bouncing, to greet Lily with the kind of joy reserved for best friends who couldn't stand to be apart. They'd sprawl on the concrete with sidewalk chalk, drawing rainbow cities around the garage drains, or sit shoulder to shoulder, sharing secrets only children seemed to trade without hesitation. Daniel would glance at them from under the hood of whatever car he was repairing, listening to the high notes of their laughter drifting across the lot. It was a sound he hadn't realized he missed, laughter that didn't belong to just Emma, but to a pair of girls who had found each other at exactly the right moment. Claire, for her part, seemed lighter each time she stopped by. At first, she still carried herself like a woman on the clock, heels precise, posture straight, phone buzzing in her bag. But slowly, the sharpness dulled. Some evenings, she'd linger against the doorway with a paper cup of coffee for him, her blazer draped across her arm, hair falling loose around her shoulders. She'd ask questions about cars, about his work, sometimes about Emma. Never too personal, but enough that he knew she was listening. Really listening. One late afternoon, as the girls raced around the lot chasing bubbles Claire had pulled from her bag, Daniel leaned against the fender of a sedan, wiping his hands. You don't have to keep bringing coffee, you know, he said, smiling faintly. Claire raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a soft smirk. And let you keep running on fumes? I don't think so. He chuckled, shaking his head. You don't seem like someone who has time for idle visits. Her gaze softened, tracing the edges of his expression as though she were trying to memorize it. Maybe that's exactly why I make time. Daniel's chest tightened at the honesty in her voice, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. It wasn't flirtation. It was something steadier, quieter, the truth of someone who had been lonely too long and had finally found a place to rest. Weeks slipped into months. Claire's laughter came easier. She no longer rushed away after picking up Lily. Sometimes she and Daniel would sit on the bench outside the garage while the girls played, sipping coffee in the dimming light. They spoke about little things, favorite foods, Emma's obsession with detective shows, Claire's battles with courthouse bureaucracy. But beneath every small detail ran the current of something larger, something neither of them named aloud. Emma noticed it before Daniel did. One evening, while drawing with Lily, she looked up at her father and whispered, "See, Daddy? I told you." He shook his head, pretending not to hear, but his smile betrayed him. Claire noticed it too, how Daniel's presence had slipped into her life not with grand gestures, but with steady, quiet care. He fixed her car, yes, but more than that, he mended the silence that had settled in her home, showing her and Lily that kindness didn't have to cost anything. And little by little, without either of them daring to name it, the walls Claire had built around her heart began to crumble. The evening air was soft with the hum of cicadas, the kind of summer night that wrapped itself gently around the small town. Daniel sat on the bench outside his garage, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Across the lot, Emma and Lily darted between chalk drawings and hopscotch squares, their laughter ringing out like a song. For once, the sound didn't echo against the emptiness of his life. It filled it. Claire stood a few feet away, her blazer folded neatly over the back of the bench, sleeves of her blouse rolled to her elbows. She wasn't the polished lawyer who had walked into his shop months ago, desperate and guarded. She was just Claire now, barefoot on the cool pavement, smiling as her daughter squealed with delight when Emma tugged her into another game. Daniel glanced at her, and the words tumbled out before he could second-guess them. "You know," he said slowly, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I didn't believe in second chances." He rubbed a thumb along the paper cup, his gaze fixed on the girls drawing hearts across the asphalt. "Not for me, anyway." Claire turned toward him, her expression softening, a strand of hair falling across her cheek. She brushed it back, eyes glinting in the light spilling from the garage. "Neither did I," she admitted. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years spent shouldering too much alone. Then, softer, until a little voice reminded me what hope sounds like. The words sank into him like a key finding its lock. He looked at her fully then, really looked, at the tired strength in her eyes, at the way her smile wasn't practiced but real. For a long moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, filled with promises they weren't ready to put into sentences. Emma and Lily ran up, cheeks flushed, hands stained with chalk dust. Emma threw herself onto the bench beside her father, leaning into his side. Lily climbed into Claire's lap, resting her head against her mother's chest with the complete trust of a child who no longer feared people leaving. The girls giggled over their drawings, their voices tangling together in perfect harmony. Daniel glanced down at Emma's hand resting against his arm, then back at Claire. She was already looking at him, her eyes glistening, not from sorrow, but from something that felt dangerously close to joy. He thought of Emma's whispered plea months ago, the conviction in her voice. "She's my mom. Please marry her." He had laughed it off then. But now, sitting here with Claire beside him and their daughters pressed close, it no longer sounded like a child's fantasy. It sounded like truth. Love hadn't arrived for them in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It had crept in slowly, hidden in the smell of motor oil, in shared cups of coffee, in laughter over burgers at a diner, in the simple faith of two little girls who had seen what the adults were too afraid to believe. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and allowed himself to smile. Not the polite smile he gave customers, but the kind that came from somewhere deeper. Claire smiled back, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted. Not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. Because sometimes broken things, cars, hearts, even whole lives, can be fixed. Not with money, not with force, but with kindness, with patience, and with the courage to believe in second chances. And so, in the dim light of a quiet summer evening, Daniel and Claire sat side by side while their daughters laughed at their feet. What had begun as a breakdown had become a beginning, and though neither said the words aloud, both understood what the children already knew. They weren't just repairing engines anymore. They were building a family.